George Russell, kudos to you. Excellent drive, getting his first Grand Prix victory. He was so emotional. You knew it meant a great, great deal to him. It felt like he was due at some point just based on how consistent he's been throughout the entirety of this season. But his first victory was a bit overshadowed based on what went down late in the race for Red Bull. Max Verstappen overtakes his teammate Sergio Perez. Max Verstappen, as everyone is aware, is already a two-time world champion. He's got it in the bag, and yet his team told him to allow Sergio to retake the position. And he said, no, not so fast, not today. I've given you my reasons. I don't want to talk about this again. And I think F1 fans everywhere were pretty shocked that he wouldn't allow Sergio Perez to advance in the race when Sergio Perez, quite frankly, has given a lot to Max Verstappen through the years. He has been a great teammate, a great support system, and he's done his job. I mean, we can go through the list of different races where he's defended well. He's done his job, taking fastest lap from people to help. And I was shocked by it. I'm curious to hear what you guys thought when it went down and he did not allow his teammate to pass in that moment late in Brazil.
Definitely shocked by it. And I was more surprised and kind of taken aback by the Verstappen radio message, to Red Bull. And just what that says about that team and the way it's run and the position that Verstappen has within it. You're absolutely right, Katie. I mean, if you were looking right now at like the perfect teammate for a world champion to have, Perez has ticked every box that you need. He gave up a win in Spain that he clearly didn't want to do, but he did it. He's not been super competitive all year, but I think he's certainly stepped up this year at points when maybe he didn't last season. But yeah, like there's no issue that Verstappen can have on that front. If this was for a win, I think that the conversation would be very different. You'd say like it is always difficult to tell a driver to give up a Formula One win, but when you're talking about sixth position, for Verstappen to behave the way he did, I think was unbelievable. And I'm surprised. I think we can dig more and more into this, but the Red Bull have always been really annoyed. Like Christian Horner gets really annoyed when people suggest that he's actually team boss of Team Verstappen. He says that's absolutely ridiculous. But Red Bull can't deny that at all now. You cannot stand behind and say that we favor both drivers equally, because not only did Verstappen do that, within half an hour of that happening, they had a debrief behind closed doors. Horner came out and said everything's fine. Max is going to support Checo in Abu Dhabi. And I thought, well, hang on a second. It doesn't matter if he's going to support him or not in Abu Dhabi. He's just shown the respect he doesn't have for his teammate. I think that Red Bull hope that, Perez will finish second and Verstappen will have a chance to redeem himself. But Verstappen showed that he does not have a basic level of respect for his teammate, and he doesn't have a respect for his team. Let's not forget, Verstappen's been fantastic this season, but that car has also been amazing. Red Bull have given him that car. They've given him his break in Formula One. Christian Horner has been Max Verstappen's biggest advocate, and to do that to the team is so disrespectful. You've basically, and I think it made Horner look super weak as well. I think you don't feel like Horner has really that much grasp over Verstappen in that situation. The more you read about it, the more you feel like, well, Helmut Marko's the guy who calls the shots in terms of what happens with the Verstappens. And I think that historically, it's clear that Marko has done anything he can to keep the Verstappens happy. Now, from a race team perspective, that makes a lot of sense. Verstappen's very, very good, but there's a line for any driver. It doesn't matter how good you are. You can't let your driver do that. You cannot. And I'm surprised that they spoke behind closed doors. It doesn't seem like Verstappen really got a big telling off. And I don't think that we should overlook that point, because I think the fact that Horner was so contrite about it, sorry, not contrite about it afterwards, was so kind of unmoved by it afterwards. He said, oh, well, it happened. We talked about it, etc. If that had happened at Mercedes, I think Toto Wolff would have been apoplectic with it. I think, we've seen Wolff really, it's funny, actually, Katie, you mentioned that Russell's race got overshadowed by the Red Bulls, because Verstappen's first win in 2016 got overshadowed by the Mercedes drivers colliding in that race. And it's a bit different, a collision versus team orders, but for Mercedes back then, that was their drivers stepping over the line. They said, you've disrespected us, you've raced too hard, we've given you the freedom to race, and you haven't shown each other or us the respect that we deserve. So you can't, it's comparing apples and oranges a little bit, but I feel like a similar response from Red Bull would have been justified. And I feel like the fact that we didn't see that shows that they feel like if they did that, Verstappen could turn around and say, well, good luck finding another driver, because I might go somewhere else, So really fascinating insight into it. And I think Verstappen had a lot of goodwill from fans this year. People looked at it and said, he had nothing to do with what happened in Abu Dhabi. Really unfair to tarnish his title win last year with that. the budget cap again. He's not the guy sorting out catering budgets or whatever. He's driven fantastically all year. And then, I felt all year like, man, we're not talking about how great this guy has been this season, how fantastic he's been. I actually kind of respected the stance he took on Netflix, because not a lot of drivers kind of speak as openly about that stuff as Max. And then in the space of 60 seconds, one radio message, and to do it to Checo as well, who I think most F1 fans like and respect and think, is a driver that has so much support. To do that to a driver like that, I think he's just undone all of that goodwill. So from a PR perspective, a bit of a nightmare. But I don't think he'll really mind about that. I think if people dislike him, I don't think that's ever been an issue. So from that perspective, I'm not saying Verstappen's going to lose sleep over it, but just really interesting how it went down.
I don't know, because I think the reason he pulled back from the Netflix series is he didn't like the way that he was being portrayed as somewhat of a villain.
A bad guy. Yeah.
And
true.
I even took a step back, because watching it, you do get that sense, right, that he's a bit cold, a bit robotic, but also that's what makes him so good at what he does. And I took a step back and thought, well, maybe they are dramatizing this, or the way that they edit the show together, it's not an accurate representation. Laurence, it doesn't get more accurate than radio messages. And I know that it's heat of the moment, and sometimes you wish you could take back what you say in those exact seconds, but nobody edited that together. I mean, that is as pure as it gets in that moment. And I think, as you heard Sergio Perez say after, he showed who he truly is. And now I don't know if Sergio regrets saying that, if that was heat of the moment, but I just don't think that this is something that is a good look for Red Bull whatsoever, Laurence.
No, it's not. And it's also something which they've clearly talked about internally, because Max referenced that. He said, I've given you my reasons before, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's the fact that this came out, it was almost like Red Bull were testing him a bit to see whether he would do it. I mean, of course, they couldn't really not tell him to swap, because Checo needs it, and they've already said so many times they want Checo to finish second in the championship, because Red Bull have never done 1-2 in the championship before. So it was always coming, but it had all been premeditated. As Max knew exactly what he was going to say. He knew exactly that he was going to reject it. And a number of races ago, people were asking him about helping Checo, and he was saying, well, I'm not Father Christmas and stuff like this, and kind of laughing it off a bit. But that is the reality. And I honestly don't think Max cares if people think bad about him or whatever. He has his version of events, and as long as he feels those version of events have been portrayed correctly, he's happy. When he gets upset is when what he sees out there somehow conflicts with how he sees the world in his head. So the fact that people don't like him for something or have a problem with him, I actually don't think he cares. I think he really is just all about going racing, and I think that's part of ultimately why he didn't want to give up a position to his teammate, because he just sees it as maybe a sign of weakness in some way. But I don't think anybody else would have seen it that way. But it's hard to get into Max's head and understand the logic of why he just wouldn't give up the 6th place. But presumably it's just because he is such an out and out racer that he doesn't believe in any situation kind of taking a team order to help out someone else. So it's a strange one, because Red Bull had this season so beautifully sewn up. We were all writing wonderful words about them in Japan. Of course, it all kind of turned a little bit with Mexico and when we got the full details of the cost cap. But again, as Nate said, Max was riding it all out. He was looking great, and then he goes and does this. And I don't really get it. I don't really know the point he was trying to prove, because that team has already always worked around him. The only thing I would disagree with Nate on is that I wasn't that surprised. When he went past Perez, I did wonder, if they're going to try and swap it back, maybe that's going to be an issue. And Max was chasing down Alonso and finished, a couple of attempts off him. And I think what Max was probably hoping in his head was like, if I can just get past Fernando, then they can't tell me to give the position back. I think he realized as he exited the final corner that wasn't going to happen, and therefore he should have given the position to Perez. But I think that's what he had in his mind. And then, and then clearly there's all this stuff that goes back. Clearly it's not as harmonious as it has looked for so much of the time that Perez and Max have been in that team. And that's a fascinating thing. What happened in Monaco? A bunch of Dutch journalists who have done a really good job at reporting around Max since he's been in Formula One. are convinced that Max is convinced that Checo crashed on purpose in qualifying in Monaco, and therefore stopped Max from setting his fastest final Q3 lap, which could have been good enough for pole, and I guess therefore a likely victory in Monaco. And so this thing has been floating around, and there's all these new conspiracy theories around it, because at the time there were lots of people on Twitter saying, wait, did Checo just crash on purpose? Because we've seen drivers either do that and being found guilty of it, which is what Michael Schumacher did, or we've seen drivers do that and everyone being pretty convinced that they've done it on purpose, which is what happened with Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton. And so it does happen in Monaco. And then there was all these rumors about it, and everyone looked and they're like, no, you wouldn't crash there if you were going to pick a place. You certainly wouldn't rear end the car into a barrier, because you have this danger of gearbox damage, which is an immediate 5-place grid penalty if the gearbox has to be replaced. And so it all kind of got completely laughed off really by most of the people in the media center. But then clearly in the Verstappen camp, it seems that thought was always there, and now it's come back out and it's come back to the surface, and now the whole of Twitter has gone off on it again, trying to prove through throttle traces and what have you that Checo intentionally rear-ended his car through a blind corner in Monaco, which I just don't think you would do if you were going to make that decision. So it's great, isn't it, in a way, because it has given this whole new dimension to Red Bull and everything that was going on there. And the team must have known about this, because it sounds like they have talked about it previously. And so now it's a little bit out in the open, and that's when the best stories kind of come to light, isn't it? When they get on the open and we can kind of start to poke around it a bit and ask a few more questions.
So what's funny about Sunday was I asked Red Bull, I said, can you just give us a bit of insight into this Monaco situation? And the team insisted that Monaco did not come up in that post-race debrief they had, but they didn't offer an explanation as to what else it could be. So I'm pretty convinced that this Monaco thing is the reason. I think Red Bull are going to go fully the other way and deny that this weekend. But it gives another great insight into the Verstappens. This has lingered for 5 months. They've been sitting on this. They haven't been able to forgive. They haven't been able to forget. And I don't even think, I don't buy that Perez did it, because all those things Laurence said were true. But also, if he did crash there, and according to the Dutch press, he then admitted that he had crashed intentionally in Baku. I'm not sure whether that's true. We haven't been able to confirm that ourselves. But he would have had to go to Helmut Marko and Christian Horner and said, look, guys, not only did I risk the penalty that Laurence mentioned, not only did I crash intentionally at Monaco, I also did it and let our, at the time, close championship rival Ferrari lock out the front row. Like, ignore the fact he went on and won the race. Like, Ferrari qualified first and second in that race in the the hardest circuit to overtake. So for Perez to have done it is one thing. For him to have admitted it, I think, is a completely different situation. So I find it really difficult to get on board with that. But if people cast their minds back then, the day after that race, Jos Verstappen wrote on Max's website this blog that just tore the team apart, said Red Bull didn't do it because obviously Perez went on and won on the Sunday with a great pit call. It was one of his, that and Singapore really stand out as two great career drives from him this season. Sorry, in his career, but 2 wins that he's had this season. But Jos Verstappen completely tore the team apart, tore them a new one, said, the strategy was terrible. They left all these points on the table against Ferrari. And again, in that situation, Red Bull didn't do anything about it. They said, well, it is Jos, it is, it's Max's dad, it's not Max. And so it's a fascinating dynamic there. And I think the big question now is whatever happens in Abu Dhabi, we'll see how it plays out. But next year, let's hope Perez is more competitive. Let's hope Mercedes and Ferrari are more competitive. If there's a situation next season where, Perez is in front of Max and Red Bull say, Checo, can you let Max through? If I was Perez, I'd turn around and tell them where to go. I'd say, no, he showed me what he thought of me last year. I'm not doing that. And whether that would cost him his job or not is a different question. Maybe that ultimately in his head is say, if I do this, I probably won't stay around, which is what we talked about with Ricciardo. So that's why him being there, maybe, there's a different element to it. But yeah, it's just set up such a needless thing for them next season. So I'm stunned it's happened. And yeah, I mean, it does give us a good talking point for the final race, because otherwise, sometimes at this point in the season, you don't have anything to talk about. I'm sure for Toto Wolff, he was a bit annoyed that we spent all that time talking about Red Bull. But yeah, just really fascinating. I can't think of a comparison in other sports where something like this has happened. I know there was this Ronaldo interview this week with Man United, but that
No other sport compares. That's why I
Yeah,
think that this is
even
such
that
a
is like, you know,
fascinating
that's in
dynamic.
a controlled environment. This was, you know, in the middle of competition, a driver or a competitor ignoring their team, you know, and giving a pretty flimsy reason for doing so, which, yeah, unbelievable.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube, and for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app, and for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.